Hello there. I think I am live. Something is scrolling on my screen here. Fantastic. It's nearly 3 o'clock, so hello to everyone from Dublin, Ireland. Um, I'm a property buyer here in Dublin, Ireland, and I am thrilled actually to be doing my first Facebook Live and glad that you're here to join me as well. And thanks to Debbie and to Carla and to Regina for coordinating this. So, like me, this is my first Facebook Live, and for many people who are buying properties, it's their first time to buy a property, or perhaps it's something that they haven't done for a few years. So the purpose of my presentation today is to share my experience of something that I'm doing every day in and day out, finding property for people to either buy or to rent here in Dublin. So I'm going to share 10 tips with you. But before I do, I just want to give you an overview of my experience of how property buyers here are responding to the COVID situation. So, in general, the people who are my clients who are buying for their own use, as in to be owner occupiers, they are usually, for the most part, happy to go ahead. As far as they're concerned, it's taken them time to get their finances organized. It's taken them time to find the right property. It's taken them time to get sale agreed on the right property, and they don't want to throw it all away. However, they don't want to pay the full price that they agreed to pay either. So what we have done in most cases is renegotiate the price at which we went sale agreed. So just to give you two examples, in the case of, say, a property that we went sale agreed to buy at 305,000, where the asking price started at 295,000, we went back and we renegotiated to 290,000. So it was asking 295, we went sale agreed at 305, and then we renegotiated back to 290,000 just to keep the deal together. So that's one example. Another example was a property buyer who was buying an apartment to live in. The apartment was on the market asking 245,000. My client went sale agreed at 262,000, but since COVID happened, we went back to renegotiate it to 252,000. So by and large, we're renegotiating approximately 5% off the price we had agreed to go to buy it at before COVID struck. So that's just to give you an overview of where things are at here in Dublin in terms of what our buyers doing. So to get on to my tips, and there's a copy of my slides available to anyone who wants to get them. I think Carla kindly said she'd post them in the link below this video. So the first tip I'm going to say to you is to get your money ready first. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if you saw a property that you liked tomorrow, could you physically buy it? Have you the money in your account now to buy it? Or have you a letter of loan offer that's valid, that's in date, that's for the amount that the property is for? And I want to give you 3 examples of where buyers of mine thought they had their money together, but in fact, it just wasn't fully together, and it was sufficiently not together that the sale fell through. So I just want to give you some examples. In the first case, my client was someone who was borrowing to buy. He was a busy barrister, he had plenty of means, he had cash to put towards the purchase, but he also needed to borrow. He'd had provisional chats with his bank, and his bank had said no problem. However, in the case of this particular client, they were separating, and in order for him to borrow, the former spouse needed to sign a declaration to the effect that the property he was purchasing was not the family home. So the issue there was that while in theory he was a purchaser who was happy to buy using a loan, and which the bank were happy to give them, he hadn't cleared all his lines sufficiently to allow that bank to be able to lend him the money. Because when you went to ask his former spouse to sign this thing, she didn't, which meant he couldn't borrow. So what I mean is, if you think you are borrowing, what I suggest is you go the whole way down the road to actually getting that letter of loan offer in date and addressed to you, just to make sure that you are indeed a borrower and you will have access to those funds. The second example of a client who thought they were a cash buyer, but in the end proved not to be, was this. My client had funds. I had seen at this stage proof of funds, cash in a bank in another country. But when the client went to take the cash into this country, it triggered a tax liability. So the result of that was the cash which the buyer thought they had was not actually the same amount, because when they repatriated it to this country, they had a significant tax liability, which in turn reduced the amount they were able to spend. So when I say, are you a cash buyer, I mean, have you the cash in your account right now in this currency ready to close the deal tomorrow? That's cash. And the third example of people who thought they were fine and ready to buy, everything's okay, was someone who was putting shares towards the pot of what she was purchasing. So she was both borrowing, she had some savings, but she was also going to sell some shares to finance this purchase. Now, the problem with that was when she went to sell the shares, which is effectively last week, she wasn't able to sell those shares because they had no value, because the market was stopped for those particular shares because of the crisis. So the point I'm making with put your money first is go the whole way of the journey of getting that money in an account ready to spend, or getting that loan offer written and ready for you to draw on. Otherwise, you're just thinking you have it ready, but you haven't actually got it ready. And if you don't have your money ready now, then you can't buy in this market, because the houses that are for sale now may not be for sale when you have got your money together. So that's my first tip, is get your money together now. Now, my second tip is get clear on your budget. Now, that's a different thing to your money. And the reason is this. It could be that you are loan approved to buy a certain amount. And take the case of recent clients of mine who were a young couple, and they were loan approved to spend $800,000 on a property. And so that's what we started off looking for. However, after a couple of weeks of working with this client, I realized, these clients, although they have loan approval for 800,000, their actual comfort level, their gut comfort level, is 600,000, because they're getting married. They hope they may have a baby in the next year or two. They want to not be leveraged to the full amount, so they don't want to borrow their full amount. Now, if we had had that conversation earlier, it would have stopped us looking altogether at that high price point, because technically they could afford to buy at that high price point, but their guts didn't want to buy. Their guts were happy with 600,000. So I'm asking you, if you are considering buying and you're approved for X, are you happy to spend X? Because if you're not, I suggest you talk to your guts about what you're happy to spend and listen to them, because in the end, I think it's your guts that will end up making that decision. And what you'll do is you'll save your time, so you're not pendulum swinging between two different price points, never fully settling on one. So that's my second tip. Get really comfortable about what you are actually happy to spend, regardless of what you're approved for. So my third suggestion is that if you're not sure if you want to move property or not, you're uncertain, my suggestion is that if you have a house to sell that you'd have to sell anyway in order to buy a new property, then I suggest you clear your house and declutter your space. Because in my experience, decluttering your space helps you declutter your thinking. So even if you don't have a house to sell, even if you're just renting now and you're still not sure if you want to buy, why not clear all your space? Fix the things that are broken, clear the surfaces. And my feeling is that by clearing your clutter, you will actually clear your thinking too, and that will help you. So my next point is point 4. Sorry for the locations. So it can be that people get really scattered when they go to look for locations, and it can be exhausting if you've an awful lot of locations in your mind that you're looking at. So here is my approach. When you combine your budget along with the property, the minimum size you need, the minimum number of bedrooms, as well as your own preferences, the chances are there aren't a million locations that are going to be suitable for you. It's like three circles that intersect. There's your budget, there's your actual daily timetable. Where do you need to be and when every day? And then there's your preferences. What kind of person are you? What do you like to do? The point where those three circles intersect is not going to be enormous. It's not going to be a huge intersection, but nonetheless, there might be maybe 6 or 7 locations that you could consider. And my suggestion is just consider 3. Narrow the range of locations that you're prepared to consider right now to 3. And instead of picking up the phone to agents and arranging viewings for those properties, my suggestion is you basically date each of those 3 neighbourhoods. So by dating, I mean these evenings are nice, they're getting longer now. So I'm suggesting that maybe after work, you go and drive to the neighbourhood, park there, get out of the car and take a walk around and see, is there anything about this neighbourhood you like? Is there a coffee shop that looks like it's your kind of place? Are the people here your kind of people? So do that for each of 3 neighbourhoods. And what I would suggest you do is go one evening after work so that you get a sense of how the neighbourhood feels in the evening. Are there gangs of teens hanging around? Excuse me, I'm just going to pour a glass of water here. Are there gangs of teens hanging around, or are people out chatting on the streets, or what's the vibe in the neighbourhood in the evening? And then have a look at the neighbourhood again on a Saturday and see what's the general atmosphere here on a Saturday. And by walking around the neighbourhood, you'll probably get a sense of, oh, these streets are nicer. Maybe they're tree lined, maybe the parking's easier than other streets. So it'll sharpen your understanding of where's nice in that particular neighbourhood. So that tip is narrow your focus down to 3 locations. And of those 3 locations, take your time, take a week per location to just get a feel for them and see what you think of them. And figure out, could you see yourself living here? So that's the 4th tip. Just narrow your location search down to 3. Now, the 5th one is, before you ever pick up the phone to your agent, at this point we're assuming that the property you're interested in is within your budget. We're assuming it's in a location that you like, that it works for your purposes, that you can do your work routine, your child routine, your hobby routine from here. All those things now add up. We're building up the picture of the kind of property you like. So the next thing to ask yourself is, before you ever pick up the phone to the agent to arrange a viewing, my suggestion is that you do a drive-by viewing of this property. And by doing a drive-by viewing, you can actually tell an awful lot of things. And here are some of the things you can tell. For starters, you can tell where the property is positioned on the road. So ideally, we don't want to be buying a property that's right up close to the traffic lights, or we don't want to be buying a property at a T-junction where there's a big road facing into the house the whole time. We want to buy a property that's in a quiet spot on the road. So we can tell, we can see where it actually is physically located on the stretch of road by doing a drive-by. We can tell whether you're able to turn right and left into and out of the property, e.g. is the road one way, or is there a solid white line down the centre of the road? These things will have an impact on day-to-day life, because if you have to keep doing a big loop every time you want to go home or every time you want to leave your house, that'll have a bearing on your day-to-day commute and timings. You'll also be able to see if there's a double yellow line outside the house, in which case it's likely it'll be a little bit tricky for visitors coming to visit you and park. You'll be able to see if there's a bus stop outside the house, or is there a chip shop beside the property? Is there an empty site that looks like it's going to be developed, in which case you can ask the neighbours around if they know what is going to be developed there, or you can do a planning search on it. When you do a drive-by, you'll also physically be able to look at the house. So those pictures of the garden taken with a wide-angle lens, you'll be able to tell, oh, the garden is actually as big as I thought, or the garden is much smaller than I thought. You'll be able to tell what condition the roof is in. Are there any missing slates? Are there plants growing out of the gutter, out of the chimney, which indicate there are cracks, which indicate that maybe there's some moisture getting in somewhere. You'll be able to tell what the neighbours look like. Have they got their cars up on blocks in the front? Are they hanging out, smoking a cigarette out the window? Would you like to live beside these people? So these are some of the things you can tell from doing a drive-by viewing. And another thing you can tell is, what's the scope for extension like on this street? Is it possible, can you see that other neighbours have done dormer windows in their roofs, or have other neighbours converted the garage or built out over the garage? So doing a drive-by gives you a very good sense of whether this house is ruled out for you or whether it hasn't ruled itself out by doing a drive-by viewing. So at that point, you might conceivably get a bit more serious about the property. So at this point, I'd like to share with you some things, some features, some characteristics of a property that makes one property more valuable than another. And the reason I'm sharing these features with you, it's to really build your confidence, is that when you go looking at a property, you know, what is it about this property that's really going to hold its value? And here are some of the things that are not changeable about properties that make it a valuable property. So the first thing is something we alluded to just a few minutes ago, which is its physical position on the road. If it's a property that overlooks a beautiful green or a park, that's never going to change, and that will always have value. So that's worth paying for. If it has lovely views from any window, that will never change. That also has value. If it has a sea view from the upstairs bedroom, well, and it's not likely to be built in front of, well, that adds value to that property. If you're within 12 to 15 minutes walking distance of a good transport link, that's a valuable thing. If the back of the house faces south or southwest, that is a desirable feature, and one that another buyer on the day you go to sell is going to be happy to pay you money for. If the site is level, that's desirable. Sometimes properties have steps up to the garden or a big sloping driveway up or down to the house. Those kind of features are not so desirable because it means that maybe on an icy day, if you're trying to park your car, it might slip down the driveway. Or if your garden is on a slope facing the back, it could mean that moisture is draining down to the house. So a level site is a lovely thing to have. Also, you may have a big plot that the house sits on, but actually it's not just the size of the garden, as you can imagine. It's where that garden is. And it's much more valuable if the garden is at the back of the house, where you can use it in privacy, than if the garden's at the front or if the garden's at the side. So in general, where the garden is big, if it's big at the back, that's really the ideal thing. And also, even if the property doesn't have off-street parking, if it has the potential to put off-street parking in, that's also a valuable commodity. If it has side access, so that you can bring your bins around the back, that is a great feature. And the views we've mentioned. So they are features that add intrinsic value to a property that's no harm for you to know about when you go shopping. Now, let's assume you've done your drive-by, you can afford it, it hasn't ruled itself out on the basis of the site or the shape of the site or where it is located. So how do you get the most out of your viewing? So this is a trick I like to do, and I'm just sharing it with you in case it's of interest to you. And it is, I walk into the property assuming I've bought it already. And you know that feeling of buyer's remorse, you know when you've brought that thing home from the shop that you've actually bought, that's when you really look at it and you think, oh, maybe pink wasn't such a good colour or whatever. So my advice is walk into the property on the basis that you've actually bought this property. And how do you feel about it now? What is it that appeals to you? So when you walk into the viewing and you look at that lovely feature fireplace, that's probably something, and it brings your energy up. That's going to keep bringing your energy up. So look at it as though you've bought it. Figure out what you like about it. Now figure out what is it about it that might make you regret having bought it. For example, if you look out the windows and you see that the neighbour has pigeon lofts, or it's extremely overlooked, if you walk out into the garden and you see that the next door neighbour is looking back in at you, these are things that are never going to change and that are going to make you unhappy once you've bought the property. So really look at it. Go to the viewing as though you own it and see what you like about it, but see what you don't think you could live with about it either. So that is, for example, I had a client who went sale agreed on a property, and she booked a 1-hour coaching session with me because although she was sale agreed, she actually never saw the property in the daylight. She went sale agreed on it when she'd only seen it at an after work viewing in the dark. And when she went back to see it in the daylight, she looked out the window and she saw the next door neighbour had a big load of pigeons at the back. And she wasn't sure that she was happy with that at all. So it goes without saying, if you've only seen the property in the dark, it definitely makes sense to go and view it in the light as well. And perhaps you all know this already, but a useful thing to know is that the sun shines from the south at 12 o'clock midday. So if you're going to a property viewing and you're not sure which way it faces and you're there at midday, just look where the sun is or use the compass on your phone. The sun is always shining from the south at midday. So when you're in the property at a viewing, ask yourself questions like, where will I keep the bins? Ask yourself very practical things. Where will I put my washing machine? Where will I have my cup of tea in the morning? Where will it catch the sun? Ask yourself those questions. Now, tip 8 is to have a good look at a floor plan. So let's say you like the property and maybe you went to see it at an open view and you were a little bit distracted. You weren't fully present with how the house flowed. The floor plan, as I'm sure you know, is a brilliant way of figuring out a few things about the house. The first thing, it shows you the flow of the house. And for example, I was looking at a property the other day in advance of going to view it with clients. And I looked at the floor plan, and straight away from the floor plan, I could tell that there were 2 rooms in the property that were kind of landlocked. And by which I mean you had to walk through 2 other rooms to get to that room. So that just means that that space is not as valuable as space that's served by a hallway, because when you have to walk through one room to get to another room, you kind of cannibalize the room that you have to walk through. That's not such a valuable space. So the floor plan gives you the flow of the house, and the floor plan also indicates where the plumbing is, and that means that if you're considering putting in an ensuite, it shows you where the plumbing is downstairs and where it might be easiest to put an ensuite in upstairs, or shows you if it would be easy to put in an ensuite upstairs. So floor plans are useful to look at thoroughly. And if your agent doesn't provide a floor plan, I think it's reasonable to ask them to provide a floor plan. Most agents do. Another thing, just before I leave floor plans, when you look at it, is to consider if 1 bedroom looks big enough to become 2 bedrooms. That's always an option. So my 9th tip is to confirm if you and the vendor of this property are a match. So for example, if you've just got your loan approval today and you're hot off the press out to view properties and you see one that you love, but that property's been on the market for a few weeks, it has a bid on it that the vendor is very inclined to accept, that property may not be just the right fit for you because the agent has probably gone down a bit of the road with another buyer and has seen proof of funds of that buyer. Maybe that buyer already has had a survey done of that property. And the agent may just not be delighted to have a new bidder entering the scene. They may just want to close the deal with this buyer, and they may be under instructions from the vendor to wrap it up as quickly as possible. So just because a house is technically still available, it may be that you're just at the start of your search, but the property is coming towards the end of its sales cycle, and you may not just be the right match. You mightn't intersect at the right time. So from a timing point of view, you want to check that the property itself is a good match for you. A second thing you might like to check is if this property needs a cash buyer. For example, I bought a property recently for a client of mine who was a cash buyer. Now, in the end, it turned out it was good that she was a cash buyer because the boundaries of this property, as shown on the physical site, were not the same as the boundaries as shown on the title deeds. So therefore, if a bank mightn't have been so happy to lend on those title deeds because it was actually a smaller site that had been surveyed, that had been valued by the valuer. However, my client, because they were a cash buyer, didn't need to get the bank's approval. She was able to make her own judgment call, and the property in question was a high value. It was 1.3 million euros. And she said, fine, I don't mind. I'm happy. I'll live with this. And that was a match for her. As it happened, she was a cash buyer, but as it happened, she needed to be a cash buyer because the property didn't have really proper good title. You also want to find out, is the vendor in a chain? Imagine if you're in a chain when you go to buy the property and the vendor is a chain and in turn buying from someone who's in a chain. That could be a very long story for you with lots of room for that thing to fall through, for that whole deal to fall through. So perhaps maybe that isn't the right match for you, especially if perhaps you're expecting a baby and you need to have this deal closed. Well, then you want to get into a more certain deal where the time frame is more certain. So it's worth checking, what is the vendor situation and what do they value? Not all vendor values the highest price. Sometimes a vendor values the person who can complete the quickest. Maybe a vendor values someone who's going to use it as a family home rather than someone buying it as an investment. So that's another thing to consider. Are you and the vendor a match in terms of just pure preferences? And then finally, I'm suggesting, this is my 10th tip, which is get your team together now. Even if you're just starting your property search, at some point you're going to need a surveyor, and at some point you're going to need a solicitor. So rather than wait until your sale agreed to go and buy this property, when you're kind of over a barrel and in your hurry, you need to get a name of a solicitor, you need to get a name of a surveyor quickly. If you get those names now, it gives you the time to get a good recommendation from a friend or a colleague that you trust. So that's the first thing. It gives you time to get a good recommendation, not just any recommendation. It also gives you time to road test that person, as in to Google them, to read their blogs, to ask them if they've any blogs, to ask them if they've any advice for you at this point while you're looking. A surveyor may say, oh, you're looking at a 1930s type of house. In my experience, they often have asbestos roofs or something like that. The surveyor, if you engage with them early, might mark your card in terms of what you could or couldn't be looking for if you're looking in a certain area. If you get a solicitor lined up soon enough, then you can check if they're friendly, if you like dealing with them, if you like them. You can you can ask them about their prices. You can shop around for 3 prices. And you can ask the solicitor, how do they usually work with you? And set up a way of working, which is, I want to talk to you once a week, say on a Thursday, and get an update as to how this deal is going. So you can set things up well with enough notice, and then you can have enough time to read their blogs, get their advice, and set up a decent working relationship with them and shop around for quotes. So these are the tips that I have to share, and I hope you found them useful. And I'm totally open to questions. I'm not sure if I'm going to be physically able to see them or how to do it, but I am open for questions. Now, let's see how we might go about. I'm going to just look at notifications to see if I got any questions. Now, end live video. So what I'm going to do is maybe I'm going to look at Facebook on my phone just to see if there are any questions coming in. Excuse me while I do this. Now, okay. So I don't see any questions here. So I'd just like to say thank you all for watching and for sharing my Facebook Live with me. And my presentation, a copy of my slides is below. Thank you.